In the autumn of 1943, General Hitoshi Imamura stood in the tunnels beneath Rabaul and surveyed what he had built. The tunnels ran for miles under the volcanic rock of New Britain. They were wide enough for vehicles, reinforced with concrete, deep enough to shelter an entire army from any aerial bombardment the Americans could deliver. Above ground, gun batteries covered every beach, every approach, every possible landing point. 5 airfields, supply depots, field hospitals, artillery positioned to destroy any fleet that attempted to enter the harbor. 100,000 men. Imamura was 55 years old, a professional soldier who had spent his career in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had commanded forces in the Dutch East Indies campaign. He was now commander of the 8th Area Army, responsible for Japanese forces in New Britain, New Ireland, New Guinea, the Solomons, and adjacent islands. Imamura's job was to hold Rabaul. He was very good at his job. He built tunnels sheltering his entire garrison from aerial bombardment. He positioned artillery to cover every landing beach. He stockpiled supplies and organized his defenses with the systematic professionalism of a man who expected the Americans to come, who knew they would have to come, and who intended to make them pay an enormous price. He was waiting for the Americans. Japan had a plan for exactly this moment, 30 years in the making. Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. The Americans would advance island by island. They would fight through the perimeter. They would be weakened by each engagement. Then, Japan would destroy them in one final, overwhelming battle. Tsushima, 1905. Russia's Baltic fleet annihilated in a single afternoon. Russia sued for peace. This was the template. Imamura had done his part. The fortress was ready. 2,000 miles away in Brisbane, Douglas MacArthur was looking at the same map with a different idea. A fortified island without air cover was not a fortress. It was a prison. You did not need to storm a prison. You only needed to lock the door. MacArthur understood something Japanese doctrine had not accounted for. Take the islands with weak defenses that can support airfields. Skip the heavily defended ones. Build airfields. Extend air cover. Leap again. Leave the strong garrisons behind. Let them run out of food. MacArthur called it leapfrogging. The Japanese had no word for it because their doctrine had no category for it. Kantai Kessen assumed the Americans would attack the perimeter. MacArthur had decided to jump over it. In February 1944, American carrier aircraft attacked Truk, the massive Japanese naval base in the Caroline Islands, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific. Truk was heavily defended. It was also bypassed. The Americans attacked it from the air, destroyed the ships in the harbor, and moved on. They did not need to land. They needed only to neutralize it, and they did that from 40,000 feet. 20,000 Japanese soldiers were left on Truk. They were not dead, they were irrelevant. There is a difference. Dead soldiers are no longer a problem. Irrelevant soldiers are still eating, still requiring food that is no longer coming, still waiting for orders that no longer matter. The pattern was set. Rabaul was next. Imamura received the news in stages. American forces on Green Island, northwest of Rabaul, then on the Admiralty Islands, north of Rabaul. The encirclement was complete. There would be no reinforcement, no evacuation, no assault on the beaches his artillery covered, no attempt on the harbor his gun batteries commanded, no attack on the tunnels he had spent 2 years building. The Americans were not coming. His fortress was perfect, and perfectly useless. The decisive battle Kantai Kessen had promised, the battle 30 years of Japanese planning had prepared for, was not going to happen at Rabaul. The Americans had refused to give it to him. 100,000 men, the strongest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific, all of it aimed at a battle that was moving away from him, westward through the Pacific, on islands his men would never see. He gave the order to begin farming. If the Americans would not come to them, they would have to feed themselves. This was not in the manual. The manual described how to build defensive positions and hold them against enemy assault. It did not describe how to grow sweet potatoes in volcanic soil to feed 100,000 soldiers waiting for a battle that had decided to go somewhere else. Kantai Kessen had no provision for irrelevance. It had only a provision for the decisive battle. The decisive battle was not coming. The airfield was the weapon. This was the insight that made leapfrogging work. Not the bypassing itself, which was conceptually simple, but the understanding of what an airfield could do in the Pacific's vast distances. An airfield on a captured island extended the range of American aircraft by hundreds of miles. Aircraft could now patrol, attack, and interdict Japanese supply routes in waters that had previously been safe. The next island MacArthur wanted could now be covered by land-based air power during the amphibious landing. The island after that was now within range for reconnaissance. Each airfield was a stepping stone. Each stepping stone enabled the next leap. The Japanese defensive perimeter assumed each island would defend its neighbors. Reinforcement flowing between positions. Aircraft from Rabaul covering Bougainville. Aircraft from Bougainville covering the Solomons. An interconnected system. Leapfrogging broke the connections. When American forces landed on a weakly defended island and built an airfield, they cut the air corridor between Japanese positions on either side. Rabaul's aircraft could no longer safely reach forward positions. Japanese destroyers running supplies at night found the route increasingly dangerous as American air power extended its reach. The garrisons did not fall. They simply became disconnected from the system that had given them meaning. MacArthur described his strategy after the war with the satisfaction of a man who had worked out something elegant. Strike only where the enemy is weak, bypass where he is strong. Use air power to make the strong positions irrelevant. "I shall destroy him," MacArthur wrote, without meeting him. To destroy a Japanese garrison, you did not need to kill its soldiers. You needed to remove its purpose. A garrison whose position has been bypassed, whose supply line has been cut, whose strategic value has been eliminated, that garrison is destroyed as a military force, even if every soldier in it is still alive and armed. Readiness without purpose is not military power. Imamura's 100,000 men were ready, armed, their tunnels intact, their artillery in position. They had no purpose. The war had moved past them. Imamura was being destroyed without being met. There was no single moment when Rabaul fell, only the gradual tightening, each American leap bringing the air perimeter closer, each new airfield further restricting supply routes, each passing month consuming the stockpiles Imamura had so carefully assembled. Soldiers became farmers. The garrison planted taro and sweet potatoes in the volcanic soil. They fished. They maintained their weapons, waiting for orders that would not come, for an assault decided against in a conference room in Brisbane. A 1951 naval history described conditions in the Rabaul garrison precisely. In tunnels below the ground, food rotted, ammunition rusted, and men deteriorated. Of the 100,000 Japanese garrisoning Rabaul, a fourth were on the sick list. 25,000 soldiers incapacitated, not by American weapons, but by the arithmetic of isolation. Insufficient food, insufficient medicine, the slow biological cost of being left behind. This was what MacArthur had meant by withering on the vine, a precise description of what happened to a garrison when its supply lines were cut and its strategic purpose eliminated. The vine was the perimeter. The Japanese garrisons were the fruit. When the perimeter was bypassed, the vine was cut. The fruit began to wither. Imamura surrendered in September 1945, more than a year after the last meaningful military operation involving Rabaul. He handed over a force that had spent the final year of the war growing food and maintaining weapons that would never be used. He had held Rabaul until the end. It had not mattered. Kantai Kessen had promised one thing: the decisive battle would come. Japan would meet the Americans on chosen ground at chosen time with full strength. At Rabaul, Japan had chosen ground and full strength and had waited 3 years. The Americans had chosen somewhere else. The decision to bypass Rabaul was not obvious. In late 1943, American military planners had been debating it for months. The conventional view, held by many senior officers, was that Rabaul had to be taken. It was the largest Japanese base in the South Pacific. It anchored the entire Japanese defensive position in the region. Leaving it intact and operational behind Allied lines was, by the logic of conventional military strategy, unacceptable. Rabaul had to be neutralized. The question was how. The traditional answer was assault. Land forces, supported by naval gunfire and air power, would storm the beaches, fight through the defenses, and capture the base. It was how military objectives had been taken for centuries. You went to where the enemy was strong, and you fought through it. MacArthur proposed a different answer. His argument was not that Rabaul was too strong to take, though it was. His argument was that Rabaul did not need to be taken. What needed to happen was that Rabaul needed to be neutralized, rendered unable to threaten Allied operations, cut off from the supply routes that fed it, stripped of the aircraft and ships that made it dangerous. All of this could be accomplished without a single American soldier setting foot on New Britain. The key was air power and geography. The Pacific Ocean is enormous. The distances between islands are measured not in miles, but in hundreds of miles. A Japanese garrison on an island that is surrounded by American-controlled sea and sky is not a garrison anymore. It is a collection of men in a very large prison, slowly consuming their supplies, unable to interfere with anything that happens beyond the horizon. Making Rabaul that kind of prison required two things: control of the sea lanes around New Britain and control of the air above them. Both were achievable without a direct assault on Rabaul itself. In January 1944, MacArthur presented his plan to the Joint Chiefs. The decision to bypass Rabaul, to encircle it, neutralize it from the air, and leave its garrison to, as he put it, wither on the vine, was approved. The plan required capturing the Admiralty Islands, north of Rabaul, to complete the encirclement. The Admiralties were only lightly defended. On February 29, 1944, MacArthur himself went ashore during the initial reconnaissance, a characteristically theatrical gesture from a man who understood the power of symbol, and personally assessed that the islands could be taken. They were taken in a month. With the Admiralties in American hands, Rabaul was surrounded. Its 5 airfields were now within range of American land-based aircraft. Its harbor was covered by American naval forces. The supply routes to New Britain from the north, west, and east were all compromised. Imamura's fortress was complete and sealed. General Kenny, MacArthur's air commander, had initially opposed the bypass. He had argued that Rabaul's airfields would need to be captured to support further Allied operations. MacArthur overruled him. The Allies would build their own airfields on the islands they had taken. Rabaul's airfields would become irrelevant because Rabaul would become irrelevant. The debate about whether to bypass Rabaul or assault it had come down to a question of time and lives. An assault on Rabaul would have required a massive amphibious operation against heavily prepared defenses. American casualties would have been significant. Planners estimated weeks of bitter fighting against 100,000 defenders in prepared tunnels and fortified positions. The outcome was not in doubt. The Americans would eventually have taken Rabaul, but the cost would have been measured in thousands of American lives. The bypass cost almost nothing. It cost the aircraft and ships required to maintain the air and sea blockade. It cost the time of the garrisons on the islands used to encircle Rabaul. It cost essentially nothing in American lives, and it achieved the same result. Rabaul, neutralized, was as useless to the Japanese as a captured Rabaul would have been. The difference was that in one case, the Americans had paid tens of thousands of casualties. In the other case, they had paid almost none. This was the arithmetic that MacArthur had worked out. The Japanese had spent years preparing for a battle. MacArthur had decided the battle was not worth having. Rabaul was not the only fortress left behind. As MacArthur drove northwest along New Guinea toward the Philippines, and as Nimitz drove west through the Central Pacific toward the Marianas, they left a trail of bypassed Japanese garrisons stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Truk, in the Caroline Islands, the base the Japanese called their Pacific Gibraltar, had 50,000 men and the most fortified harbor in the Pacific. It was neutralized by carrier air raids in February 1944 and bypassed. Its garrison spent the rest of the war farming. Wewak, on the northern coast of New Guinea, headquarters of the Japanese 18th Army under General Hatazo Adachi. MacArthur leaped over it to land at Hollandia, 300 miles further west, in April 1944. Adachi found himself outflanked, his supply lines cut, his position rendered irrelevant in a single operation. 50,000 Japanese soldiers were stranded on the New Guinea coast, cut off from the war that had moved past them. The retreat of Adachi's forces through the Finisterre Mountains was described in American accounts without euphemism. Fatigue, straggling, disease, and starvation characterized the retreat. The two divisions that started numbered 20,000 in December 1943. 10,000 reached Madang in mid-February, half the men gone. Not to American weapons, to the starvation MacArthur's leapfrogging had imposed by cutting their supply lines. 60% of all Japanese soldiers who died in the Pacific War did not die in combat. They died of starvation and disease, the compounding biological cost of being bypassed, isolated, cut off from food and medicine, left to hold positions that had been rendered strategically meaningless. The American public knew the battles: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. These produced the famous photographs and the names that became part of the national memory. But for every Japanese soldier who died fighting an American, 2 more died of what the war had taken away from them: supply, food, medicine, the logistical infrastructure that modern armies required to function. This was the hidden mathematics of MacArthur's strategy, and it was hidden because the dying happened slowly, in isolated garrisons, without the drama of battle, in the form of disease and malnutrition, and the quiet collapse of men who had been left with no purpose and diminishing means to survive. He had built the strongest fortress in the South Pacific. He had been rendered irrelevant. The Americans had not needed to defeat it, they had needed only to ignore it. A doctrine built around the decisive battle has no answer for an enemy who refuses to fight it. MacArthur had refused. He had looked at Rabaul and Truk and Wewak and all the other fortresses in the Pacific and made the same calculation each time. Not, can we take it, but, do we need to? The answer, almost every time, was no. By mid-1944, leapfrogging had advanced the American position by thousands of miles at a fraction of the cost that systematic reduction of every garrison would have required. The bypassed garrisons, Rabaul, Truk, Wewak, dozens of smaller positions, contained hundreds of thousands of armed, organized Japanese soldiers, unable to affect the outcome of a war that had moved past them. Kantai-Kessen had promised the decisive battle. What Japan got instead was a war of distances, of airfields, of logistics, a war fought on terms that its doctrine had never modeled and its strategy had never prepared for. Imamura had built the right fortress for the wrong war. The war Japan had planned for ended at Tsushima in 1905. The war Japan actually fought ended off Okinawa in 1945, under American air cover stretching from airfields on islands that had not existed as military positions 3 years before. The Japanese army had never planned to feed itself. This was not an oversight, it was a doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Army's logistical philosophy was built around the assumption that campaigns would be short, decisive, and ultimately concluded by the kind of rapid military victory that Kantai-Kessen promised at sea. Land campaigns in China had been short enough that logistics had rarely become the limiting factor. The army had developed a culture of living off the land, of requisitioning food from occupied territories, of expecting soldiers to be self-sufficient in ways that Western armies were not. This worked in China, where the land was rich and the population dense. In the islands of the South Pacific, volcanic, isolated, far from any agricultural base capable of supporting 100,000 men, it did not work at all. When the leapfrogging strategy cut the supply lines to Rabaul, Truk, and the dozens of smaller bypass garrisons, it created a problem that Japanese military logistics had no answer for. The Army's supply system had been designed to move material to forward positions along controlled sea lanes. Those sea lanes were now contested or closed. The alternative, air resupply, required aircraft and fuel that were increasingly unavailable. The alternative to that, submarine resupply, was limited in capacity and extraordinarily dangerous as American anti-submarine warfare improved. There was no good alternative. There was only the garden. Imamura's soldiers at Rabaul dug up the volcanic soil and planted. They grew taro and sweet potatoes and whatever else could be made to grow in the nutrient-poor ground around the harbor. They organized fishing expeditions. They built irrigation systems. They maintained agricultural plots with the same systematic attention they had once devoted to military preparation. A professional army of 100,000 men reorganized for subsistence farming. The results were insufficient. The volcanic soil was thin. The agricultural yields were not enough to feed 100,000 men adequately, particularly men who were also required to maintain military readiness, conduct patrols, and perform the ongoing labor of keeping their defensive positions functional. By 1944, a quarter of Imamura's garrison was on the sick list. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery was chronic. Vitamin deficiency diseases appeared among men whose diet had been reduced to whatever the garden could produce and whatever could be caught in the waters around New Britain. The tunnels that had been stocked with ammunition in 1942 and 1943 now held ammunition that was corroding in the tropical humidity. The vehicles maintained for mobile defense were increasingly non-functional as spare parts became unavailable and improvised repairs could no longer compensate. The garrison was not defeated. It was dissolving. At Wewak, the situation was worse. Adachi's 18th Army had not had the time or the resources to prepare for isolation the way Imamura had prepared Rabaul. When MacArthur's April 1944 landing at Hollandia cut Wewak off, Adachi's men found themselves in jungle without the agricultural infrastructure that Imamura had built, without adequate supplies, and without a realistic prospect of reinforcement or evacuation. The retreating columns through the Finisterre Mountains were not military formations anymore. They were survival marches. Men carried what they could. They ate what they could find. They died at a rate that no American military action could have produced as efficiently. The American strategy had not targeted the Japanese soldiers. It had targeted the system that kept them alive. MacArthur understood this. The goal was not to destroy Japanese forces, but to render them unable to affect the campaign. A Japanese soldier spending his days farming sweet potatoes and treating malaria was not a military threat. He was occupying territory and consuming resources, but he was not a threat. He was irrelevant. And irrelevance, in a war as vast as the Pacific, was a form of defeat that did not require American soldiers to die to achieve. The question Japanese commanders could not answer was the same one the German commanders in France could not answer. What do you do when the enemy refuses to fight you? German generals in Normandy had built their doctrine around the decisive engagement, the concentrated defensive battle at the point of American penetration, the counterattack that would throw the invaders back into the sea. Patton had refused to give them the engagement they were prepared for, and had gone somewhere else before they could respond. MacArthur had done the same thing to the Pacific. He had looked at the Japanese defensive doctrine, the fortified perimeter, the strong points, the prepared positions, and had systematically declined to attack it. He had gone around it, over it, past it, leaving it intact and irrelevant behind him. Both strategies shared the same underlying insight. An enemy that has prepared a defense for a specific threat can be neutralized by removing the threat rather than engaging it. The Japanese had prepared their Pacific defenses for a threat that would come through them. MacArthur had come around them. In the spring of 1944, as Imamura's garrison at Rabaul was reorganizing for subsistence farming, the war was producing its decisive engagements not at the fortresses the Japanese had prepared, but at the places the Americans had chosen. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, were taken in the summer of 1944 in a direct assault. These islands had not been chosen for their fortifications. They had been chosen for their geography. Close enough to the Japanese home islands for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to conduct sustained bombing campaigns. Taking the Marianas required fighting. The Battle of Saipan was one of the war's bloodiest, with over 14,000 American casualties and virtually the entire Japanese garrison of 30,000 dead. But Saipan was worth fighting for in a way that Rabaul was not. Saipan gave the Americans the ability to bomb Japan from the air. Rabaul would have given the Americans a harbor and an airfield complex in a location that had been strategically bypassed. This was the other side of MacArthur's calculation. Leapfrogging was not random. The islands chosen for assault were chosen because they were worth fighting for, because they offered something that could not be obtained otherwise, something that mattered for the next stage of the campaign. The islands bypassed were bypassed because they could be neutralized without assault, and because the cost of assault outweighed the benefit. The Japanese had built their defensive perimeter without making this distinction. Every island was a fortress. Every fortress was to be held. The strategic value of individual positions was less important than the integrity of the perimeter as a whole. MacArthur had looked at the perimeter and identified its weakness. The perimeter was designed to be attacked all along its length. It was not designed to be selectively penetrated at its weakest points, while its strong points were isolated and left to irrelevance. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. MacArthur had found the weakest links, the lightly defended islands that could support airfields, and had used them as stepping stones, leaving the strongest links behind, dangling in the ocean, connected to nothing. The bypass garrisons could not reinforce each other. They could not concentrate. They could not maneuver. They could only wait, in their tunnels and on their farms, while the war that was supposed to come to them continued westward without them. The decisive battle they had been promised did eventually happen. It happened at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when the Japanese fleet attempted to use the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen against the American invasion of the Marianas. The Japanese brought their largest remaining carrier force. They maneuvered for the decisive battle that 30 years of doctrine had promised would destroy the American fleet. The Americans destroyed 400 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers. Their naval air power, the arm that was supposed to enable the decisive battle, was effectively finished. The decisive battle had come. Japan had lost it. Imamura was still farming. The numbers tell the story that the battles do not. 1.74 million Japanese soldiers died in the Second World War. Of those, 60%, more than 1 million men, did not die in combat. They died of starvation and disease. The battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, are part of the historical memory. The photographs, the casualty counts, the names that became part of national memory. They do not remember the 1 million men who died on the Vine, the bypassed garrisons. The men who were left on Rabaul and Truk and Wewak and a dozen smaller islands as the war moved west and the supply routes closed and the agricultural yields proved insufficient and the malaria and dysentery ran through the confined population of soldiers who had nothing to do but survive and wait for a battle that was not coming. They had weapons. They maintained their weapons. Imamura's garrison at Rabaul maintained military discipline until the surrender in September 1945. They drilled. They patrolled. They were, in every formal sense, an army. They were also hungry, sick, and waiting for a war that had passed them by. MacArthur had calculated that the lives of American soldiers were more valuable than the strategic objectives represented by each Japanese fortress. Taking Rabaul by assault would have cost American lives, a lot of them, against 100,000 defenders in prepared positions. Bypassing Rabaul cost almost no American lives and achieved the same strategic result. The cost was paid by the Japanese garrison. The deaths that resulted from isolation were a consequence of the strategy, not its purpose. But the consequence was real, not in the dramatic form of the climactic battle that Kantai-Kessen had promised, but in the slow, undramatic form of insufficient calories and inadequate medicine, of men who were healthy in 1943 and sick in 1944 and dying in 1945, not from American bullets, but from the collapse of their own biology under isolation. Imamura had done his job. He had built the fortress, held it, maintain military order under conditions that would have broken a less professional organization. His garrison had not mutinied. They had farmed sweet potatoes and maintained their weapons and waited. They had done everything a military garrison is supposed to do, and it had not mattered, because the enemy had decided not to come. The lesson was not lost on American military planners. The Pacific War had demonstrated that in the right circumstances, when geography allowed it, when sea and air control could be established, isolation was a more efficient weapon than assault. An army that cannot be supplied cannot function. An army that cannot function cannot threaten. An army that cannot threaten has been defeated, regardless of whether it has been engaged in combat. MacArthur had looked at the Japanese Pacific perimeter and seen not a wall that had to be breached, but a series of positions that had to be connected to be effective. He had severed the connections. The positions had remained, empty of strategic meaning, full of soldiers who were farming. The Japanese military doctrine had been built on a specific reading of history. Tsushima had worked. Russia had sued for peace. What the doctrine had not modeled was an opponent who read the same history and drew the opposite lesson. Japan built for the decisive battle. MacArthur built around it, forcing the enemy to defend everywhere, attacking where he was weak, bypassing where he was strong, making preparations irrelevant, not by defeating them, but by making them unnecessary to defeat. Tsushima had been a decisive battle. The Pacific War was a campaign of choices about where to fight, what to take, what to leave, what to value, and what to let wither. The space between battles is where Imamura's soldiers grew their sweet potatoes. The space between battles is where 600,000 Japanese soldiers died of starvation and disease. The space between battles was where the Pacific War was actually decided. The war ended on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. The ceremony was formal, brief, and witnessed by representatives of all the Allied powers. Douglas MacArthur presided. 4 days later, on September 6th, General Hitoshi Imamura signed a separate Instrument of Surrender aboard the British aircraft carrier HMS Glory, anchored in St. George's Channel between New Britain and New Ireland. He was surrendering a garrison that had not been defeated. The 100,000 men under his command in 1943 were not all there by 1945. The sick list had been a quarter of his force. The malaria and dysentery had taken their toll. The agricultural shortfalls had weakened men who were already operating in the tropical heat with insufficient calories. But the garrison was still there. The tunnels were still there. The artillery was still pointed at the beaches that the Americans had never attempted to land on. Imamura signed the surrender with the bearing of a professional soldier who understood that the war was over and that its outcome was not in dispute. An Australian war artist who witnessed the scene described his attitude as still arrogant, a screen, perhaps, for humiliation, or perhaps simply the manner of a military professional who had done his job and knew it. He had done his job. The fortress had held. The fortress had also been irrelevant for 18 months. The campaign had demonstrated things about modern warfare that no previous conflict had established so clearly. Geographic isolation, achieved through air and sea control, could neutralize a military force as effectively as direct defeat, at a fraction of the cost in lives and materiel. A defensive doctrine built around fixed positions and prepared engagements was vulnerable to an opponent who simply chose not to attack those positions, who identified the weakest points in the defensive line and concentrated there, leaving the strong points to irrelevance. And logistics was not a supporting function of military strategy. Logistics was military strategy. An army that controlled the logistics of the theater had a decisive advantage that no amount of individual tactical skill could compensate for. MacArthur had understood all of this before the campaign began. Leapfrogging was the operational expression of that understanding, using American sea power and air power to create conditions where Japanese tactical excellence would be rendered irrelevant by the simple fact that the men in the tunnels could not get enough to eat. Imamura had led professional soldiers. They had maintained their discipline. They had organized their farming operations with the same systematic attention they had brought to their military preparations. It had not been enough. The garrison that Imamura surrendered in September 1945 was armed and organized, its structure maintained through more than a year of isolation. It was also malnourished, depleted by disease, equipped with ammunition that had corroded in the tropical humidity. It was the strongest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific. It had surrendered without fighting a battle. This was the paradox that leapfrogging had created. The strongest positions were the ones that were never tested. The garrisons that had prepared the most carefully, built the deepest tunnels, stockpiled the most carefully, these were the ones that were left to starve, because their very strength made them not worth attacking. MacArthur, in his memoirs, described the leapfrogging strategy with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had found an elegant solution to an expensive problem. The problem was how to advance across a defended ocean at acceptable cost in American lives. The solution was to stop attacking what the enemy had prepared for and start attacking what he had not prepared for. What the enemy had not prepared for was being ignored. Kantai Kessen, 30 years of preparation, the doctrine that had shaped Japanese military planning since Tsushima, had been built to fight an enemy who came to the fortress. MacArthur had not come to the fortress. He had built airfields, and the fortress had starved. The harvest of sweet potatoes was not in the doctrine. The doctrine had never contemplated needing one. The principle that MacArthur applied in the Pacific had no name in 1943. MacArthur understood it intuitively, since his years at West Point, since his observation of the static catastrophes of the First World War, since his time in the Philippines watching Japanese power grow. The principle was simple. Do not fight the enemy where he is strongest. Fight him where he is weakest. Make his strength irrelevant by refusing to engage it. MacArthur fought battles. Tarawa was a direct assault against prepared defenses, and it was bloody. Saipan was bloody. Leapfrogging did not eliminate combat. It eliminated unnecessary combat. The battles required to take positions that could be neutralized without assault. The Japanese defensive doctrine was built on a specific premise. The enemy will come to the fortresses. The fortresses must be strong enough to defeat him when he comes. MacArthur's strategy was built on a specific refusal. I will not come to your fortresses. I will come somewhere else, and I will make your fortresses useless by coming somewhere else. By choosing not to assault Rabaul, MacArthur did not leave it alone. He cut its supply lines. He surrounded it with American-controlled sea and sky. He turned a military force into an agricultural community, still technically armed, still technically organized, but no longer capable of affecting the outcome of the war. This was a form of destruction, not the kind that produces dramatic photographs, the kind that produces men farming sweet potatoes in volcanic soil, counting corroding ammunition, waiting for a battle that would never come. The Japanese commanders who planned the Pacific defense had been correct about one thing. They could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was too vast, American manpower too large, American logistical reach too great. Kantai Kessen had been their answer to this problem. Win quickly, decisively, in a single battle that would shock the Americans into accepting a negotiated peace before the industrial imbalance could be brought to bear. The answer was not wrong. It was incomplete. It did not account for an opponent who understood the trap and refused to walk into it. The decisive battle, when it finally came, when the American invasion of the Marianas in June 1944 forced the Japanese fleet to fight, was a catastrophe. 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 2 days. 3 carriers sunk. The naval air power that was supposed to enable Kantai Kessen was finished. The decisive battle had happened on American terms, not Japanese ones. And Imamura was still in his tunnels. He would wait there until September 1945. He would surrender there in September 1945. He would sign his name on a document that acknowledged the end of a war he had spent 3 years preparing to fight, on an island no American soldier had found necessary to attack. The Australian war artist who painted the scene described Imamura's attitude as arrogant. It may have been something simpler. It may have been the expression of a professional soldier who had done everything his doctrine asked of him, who had built the strongest fortress in the South Pacific, who had held it through isolation and starvation and the slow dissolution of his garrison's military effectiveness, who had done his job, and who understood, standing on the deck of HMS Glory in September 1945, that doing his job had not been enough, because the enemy had not come to him. The enemy had gone somewhere else, and the war had followed. The bypassed garrisons, Rabaul, Truk, Wewak, dozens of smaller positions, contained perhaps 400,000 Japanese soldiers at their peak. Most survived the war. Most spent it farming. They did not affect the outcome. They were the vine. MacArthur had cut it. The Pacific War ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945. It had not ended the way Japan planned. Kantai Kessen had promised a decisive battle, one overwhelming engagement that would settle the question of Pacific dominance and force the Americans to accept a negotiated peace. The battle would happen on Japan's terms, at Japan's chosen location, with Japan's prepared defenses and Japan's concentrated force. The battle never came to Rabaul. The battle never came to Truk. The battle never came to the hundreds of other fortified positions that the Imperial Japanese military had constructed across the Pacific between 1941 and 1944. The positions where soldiers waited in tunnels and behind gun batteries for the assault that would give their preparation meaning. The battle came to the Marianas in June 1944, on American terms, at an American-chosen location, against a Japanese naval air force that had been weakened by 2 years of attritional fighting in precisely the ways the doctrine had never anticipated. The decisive battle happened. Japan lost. And in the tunnels beneath Rabaul, in the taro fields and sweet potato gardens that had replaced the military preparations of 1942 and 1943, Imamura's soldiers continued to wait. MacArthur lived until 1964. He remained controversial, a man of enormous ego and genuine strategic insight. The leapfrogging strategy was, most historians agree, his greatest achievement. It had advanced American forces across the Pacific at a speed and cost that conventional strategic thinking would not have predicted possible. It had, in the assessment of Japanese commanders who reflected on it after the war, created conditions for which Japanese doctrine had no answer. You cannot defend against an enemy who refuses to attack. You cannot fight a decisive battle against an enemy who has decided the battle is not worth having. You cannot feed an army from a volcanic island indefinitely when the supply ships have been driven away by air power from airfields on islands the enemy chose to take. Kantai Kessen was an attempt to escape the logic of industrial imbalance, end the war before that logic became decisive. Not irrational, simply dependent on the Americans cooperating. MacArthur had not cooperated. Imamura had built the right fortress. He had built it for the wrong war. The war he had prepared for was short, decisive, concluded by a single, overwhelming battle. The war that happened was long, industrial, fought across distances that made individual fortresses irrelevant, decided not by the strength of defensive positions, but by the capacity of each side to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan built its strategy around what it could build in the islands it held. America built its strategy around what it could build in the islands it could take. The islands Japan held were defended by men who were never attacked. The islands America took were stepping stones to the next island, until there were no more islands between American air bases and the Japanese home islands. The B-29s that bombed Tokyo in 1945 flew from the Marianas, islands taken at cost, and transformed into the platform for the campaign that ended the war. Not from Rabaul, not from Truk, from the islands that MacArthur and Nimitz had chosen to take and taken and built on, while Imamura waited in his tunnels for a battle that had already decided to go somewhere else. The Marianas had been worth fighting for. Rabaul had not. This was always the calculation. Not whether a position could be taken, but whether it needed to be. Not whether the enemy could be defeated there, but whether defeating him there mattered. Imamura could have been defeated at Rabaul. A direct assault would eventually have succeeded. But Rabaul, captured, would have given the Americans something they already had from other islands taken at lower cost. So MacArthur had not come to Rabaul, and Imamura had waited, and the war had ended somewhere else. Japan spent 30 years preparing for the decisive battle. America refused to fight it. The fortresses starved. The airfields won the war. Imamura had understood this by September 1945, standing on the deck of HMS Glory with his sword and his garrison's surrender document. He had built the right fortress. For the right war was fought on islands he never saw, by men who never came to him, toward a conclusion that his preparation had done nothing to prevent. The vine had been cut, the fruit had withered, the war was over.